My name is Cannell. I was 17 in 2021, living with my parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a place where nothing ever happened. You know the type. Calm streets lined with identical houses and people who waved politely but rarely stopped to chat. But that night, the ordinary turned into something I'd only seen in movies. It was a rainy Saturday, and my parents had gone to a neighbor's house a few streets away to play chess. They loved their games, but sitting there listening to grown-ups discuss pawns and strategies wasn't my idea of fun. I told them I'd stay home. My plan was simple: grab some snacks and watch a new horror movie. No one gets out alive. By 9:30 p.m., I was settled on the couch. The lights dimmed, and the sound of rain tapping against the windows added a creepy atmosphere. It was halfway through the movie when something made me pause. An eerie sound from outside. At first, I chalked it up to the storm, but it was persistent. I shook it off thinking, just your imagination, Kendall. Don't be weird. Then, at exactly 10 p.m., a loud bang echoed through the house. It wasn't like thunder. It was coming from the front door. My heart jumped and I froze. Who would knock this late in this weather? Slow. I crept to the door, careful not to make noise, and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood on my porch. She looked about 30, wearing a soaked rain jacket, her hair dripping as rain poured down on her. Her face was pale and she looked desperate. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need help. My car broke down and my phone's dead. Can I use yours to call someone?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening. The streetlight illuminated her car parked at the curb. Its engine was still running. That struck me as odd. Why would her car be running if it was broken? I squinted through the peephole, trying to make sense of it. Then, against all better judgment, I opened the door. She stood there, shivering. "Thank you," she said, stepping forward. But just as I moved aside, I saw him. A man in a black hoodie, sprinting toward the house, his face partially hidden, and in his hand, a gun. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut before the woman could step inside, twisting the deadbolt and locking the chain. She screamed and pounded on the door. "Let me in." "You don't understand." The man reached the porch, banging his fist against the door. "Open up!" he shouted, his voice a mix of rage and panic. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Suddenly, I heard glass shatter from the back of the house. My breath hitched as I darted toward the kitchen, where the man was trying to climb through the broken window. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy frying pan and swung it toward him. He dodged, but his hand caught on the jagged glass, leaving blood on the frame. He cursed and pulled back, disappearing into the shadows. I ran back to the living room, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator what was happening. They assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. The banging on the front door intensified and the woman's voice turned frantic. "You don't understand. Please let us in." I bolted to the bathroom and locked the door, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I texted my parents, warning them not to come home. My dad replied instantly, saying he'd called the neighbors for help too. Minutes felt like hours. The operator stayed on the line, trying to keep me calm. Then everything went silent. The banging stopped, and I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. My heart sank. The attic window? I hadn't even thought about it. Had they climbed onto the roof? The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to the staircase. The sound of sirens filled the air, and red and blue lights flashed through the bathroom window. I stayed frozen, hoping the police would reach me before the intruders did. A loud knock on the bathroom door made me jump. "Police!" a voice called. I hesitated, unsure if it was real. But then I heard voices downstairs, summoning all my courage. I unlocked the door and peeked out. Officers were moving through the house, their flashlights scanning every corner. "It's clear," one of them said. But his tone didn't reassure me. The attic window was open, but the intruders were gone. The police took my statement while other officers searched the neighborhood. My parents arrived minutes later, their faces pale with worry. My dad hugged me so tightly, I could barely breathe. "We're not leaving you alone again," he said. The police found the woman's car abandoned a few streets away. It was stolen. They discovered duct tape, zip ties, and a knife. The blood on the window frame linked the man to other home invasions in the area. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, replaying the events over and over in my mind. What would have happened if I'd let them in? The thought made my stomach turn. The woman and the man were never caught, and that's what haunts me the most. This story happened back in 2017 on Christmas Day, when I was still in my teenage years. My family was hosting a big gathering, and all my first, second, and third cousins were coming over. I was excited because it had been 3 years since I'd last seen many of them. It felt like the perfect time to catch up and celebrate together. Everyone started arriving between 11:30 and 1. The house was lively with greeting and laughter, and the dining table quickly filled with dishes everyone brought to share. My dad's cousin Lester came too. He got a fruit salad and a cheerful attitude, though I noticed something unusual about him. I'd never met him before because he lived in California, while we lived on the East Coast. Toast. So maybe it was just me adjusting to his personality. Still, something about him felt off. Lunch was served around 2:30, and everyone sat down to talk and eat. We shared stories about what had been happening in our lives, and the conversation was full of energy. It was nice to see everyone reconnecting after so much time apart. After lunch, we all took our plates to the kitchen. While I was helping tidy up, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a call from my best friend, Elsa. I picked up and walked to my room for privacy since I didn't want anyone overhearing our conversation. We mostly talked about our Christmas plans and what gifts we got. After about 15 minutes, I hung up the phone and stretched, ready to rejoin the party. Just then, I heard a knock at my door. It was Lester. I was a bit surprised. Why would he want to talk to me? Still, I told him he could come in. He stepped into the room, glancing around curiously. "Hey there," he said. "How's school going?" I told him it was fine and that I was enjoying my freshman year of high school. He asked a few more questions about my favorite classes and teachers, which seemed normal enough. But then he asked something strange. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual in this house?" I blinked at him. "Unusual? What?" He tilted his head and smiled in a way that made me uneasy. "Oh, I don't know," he said. "Sometimes old houses have their secrets." I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged and told him I hadn't noticed anything. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and left the room. I couldn't shake the odd feeling he left behind. Later, as the afternoon turned into evening, the family gathered in the living room to open presents. Everyone was laughing and chatting, but I noticed Lester sitting off to the side, staring out the window. He looked deep in thought, almost worried. When I asked if he was okay, he just smiled and said, "Oh, I'm fine, just enjoying the view." The strange thing was there wasn't much of a view outside. It was dark, and all you could see was the faint outline of our backyard trees. As the night went on, Lester's behavior became even stranger. He wandered around the house, sometimes stopping to stare at random objects, like the family photos on the wall or the antique clock in the hallway. At one point, I saw him standing by the basement door staring at it. When I asked him what he was doing, he quickly turned and said, "Oh, nothing. Just curious." Curious about the basement? It was just an old, unfinished space where we kept storage boxes. There was nothing interesting about it. Around 9 p.m., Most of the family decided it was time to leave. People hugged goodbye, thanked us for hosting, and trickled out the door. Soon, it was just my immediate family and Lester. My parents invited him to stay overnight since it was too late for him to drive to his hotel. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't say anything. Later that night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard something creak downstairs. It sounded like someone walking around. I figured it was just my dad checking the doors, or maybe Lester getting a drink of water. But then I heard the basement door open, followed by faint footsteps descending the stairs. Curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed out of my room and peeked down the hall. The basement light was on. Quietly, I made my way to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was Lester standing in the middle of the basement, holding a flashlight and examining something on the floor. "Lester," I called out. He jumped and quickly turned off the flashlight. "Oh, hi," he said, trying to sound casual. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd take a look around. Basements are fascinating. It was fascinating. That was the last word I'd use to describe ours. It was just old shelves, dusty boxes, and a few cobwebs. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there watching him. He gave me a nervous smile and walked back up the stairs, brushing past me without another word. The next morning, Lester was gone. My parents said he left early to catch a flight, but something about it didn't feel right. I decided to check the basement, and that's when I noticed it. One of the floorboards near the back wall had been pried loose. Inside the gap was a small dusty box. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were old letters and photographs, some dating back to the 1940s. They seemed to belong to the previous owners of the house. There was nothing particularly strange about them, just old memories. But why had Lester been so interested in them? When I told my parents about the box, they were as confused as I was. We couldn't figure out why Lester had been poking around in the basement or why he left so suddenly. To this day, I still wonder what he was looking for and why he acted so strangely that night. It was a Christmas I'll never forget. Not because of the presents or the family gathering, but because of the lingering mystery of Uncle Lester and the secrets he seemed to be chasing. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Back in 2019, I started my freshman year at Queens College in New York City. Now a senior, I look back on those years with mixed emotions. At the time, I was nervous but excited to begin my film studies. Being from Chicago, I only went home for breaks, spending most of my time on campus. Orientation day was nerve-wracking. I wasn't sure if I'd make friends or fit in, but by the end of the day, I had connected with other students in my program. One person, however, stood out for the wrong reasons. One's Dylan. He had a strange energy, always talking about obscure films or making random jokes that fell flat. At first, I thought he was just socially awkward, but something about him seemed off. As weeks went by, Dylan's behavior became increasingly uncomfortable. He inserted himself into conversations uninvited and often spoke loudly about bizarre topics no one could relate to. Our small friend group tolerated him because he was persistent, but none of us liked having him around. Then, one evening over dinner, Mary Kate, one of my friends, mentioned something that made us all uneasy. "Did you hear about Dylan?" she asked. "A couple of girls said he's been following them back to their dorms. They're freaked out." My stomach dropped. The idea of Dylan stalking anyone wasn't surprising, but hearing it confirmed made it real. From then on, I kept my distance, avoiding him as much as possible. Still, he always managed to find his way to our group, talking as if nothing was wrong. One afternoon, Dylan joined us uninvited at lunch. His usual nonsensical chatter turned darker when he asked, Why does everyone look at me like I'm a freak? What's their problem? I wanted to stay silent, but he kept pushing. Finally, I snapped. Maybe it's because you don't respect people's boundaries, Dylan. Not everything has to be about you. His face twisted in anger, but he didn't say anything. He stood abruptly and stormed off. That should have been the end of it. But things escalated in ways I never expected connected. Thanksgiving break arrived and I flew back home to Chicago. My parents were thrilled to have me home, and I spent my time catching up on sleep and relaxing. One night, around 9:30 p.m., I was in my bedroom scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock on my window. At first, I thought it might be a prank. My room was on the ground floor, but no one had ever knocked on my window before. Curious, I pulled back the curtain and froze. Standing there, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights, was Dylan. My heart raced. How was he here? Why was he at my house? I dropped the curtain and backed away, panic surging through me. My parents were in the living room, so I bolted to tell them what I'd seen. Mom! Dad! Dylan's outside my window. I blurted out. Who? My dad asked, frowning. A guy from school. He's been acting weird, and now he's here. My mom stood up immediately. Let's check. We went back to my room, and she peeked out the window. There's no one here, she said, her voice calm but skeptical. He was right there, I insisted, my voice shaking. Maybe you're just stressed. My dad said, it's late. Get some rest. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. How did Dylan know where I lived? Had he been following me? The following days were tense. Every time I walked past a window or went outside, I felt like I was being watched. I tried to rationalize my fear. Maybe it wasn't Dylan. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Someone who looked like him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. Back at school, Dylan was no longer attending classes. Rumors swirled that he'd been expelled for harassing other students. While it was a relief not to see him on campus, the sense of unease lingered. One night, I stayed late in the library to finish a project. As I walked back to my dorm, I felt the distinct sensation of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure in the distance. It was too dark to make out who it was, but my instinct screamed at me to hurry. I quickened my pace, heart pounding until I reached the safety of my dorm. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing subtle signs that someone might be watching me. A notebook I thought I'd left in my dorm was suddenly in my backpack. My dorm key went missing for a day before mysteriously reappearing on my desk. I couldn't prove anything, but I knew Dylan was behind it. One evening, I returned to my dorm after a late class and found a note taped to my door. The handwriting was shaky and barely legible, but I recognized the signature, Dylan. The note read, "You don't get to ignore me. We're not finished." Fear turned to anger. I took the note to campus security and explained everything that had happened, from the stalking to the incident at my home. They assured me they'd look into it and encouraged me to stay vigilant. Despite their assurances, I felt exposed and vulnerable. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window again. This time, I didn't look. Instead, I called campus security and reported the disturbance. They arrived within minutes, but whoever had been outside was gone. They found fresh footprints in the snow leading away from my window, confirming my fears. Eventually, the sighting stopped, and Dylan disappeared from my life. I never learned what happened to him, but the experience left a lasting mark. I started taking precautions, double-checking locks, walking alone at night, and being mindful of who I shared personal information with. I will never forget my very first job. As a high school senior, eager to earn extra cash over the summer, I jumped at the opportunity to work at a small but cozy theater. It wasn't far from my neighborhood, paid decently, and the job posting promised no experience required. The idea of working in a cinema, surrounded by popcorn and movies, seemed ideal. I applied and was quickly hired. The theater manager, Mr. Reynolds, had a quiet intensity about him. His instructions were straightforward. Clean the counters in the cinema seats, take out the trash, restock concessions, and help your co-worker with tickets. Oh, and one more thing. Don't linger after 2 a.m. Lock up and leave immediately. No exceptions. His tone was so serious, almost ominous, but I was too thrilled about my first job to care. The first month was uneventful. My co-worker, Alexa, was friendly, but kept mostly to herself, and our shifts passed smoothly. The pay was better than I'd expected, though I never questioned it. But as I settled into routine, I began noticing strange things. Alexa seemed nervous on certain nights, especially on weekends. She worked fast, rushing to close up by 1:30 a.m., and she would insist I do the same. Once, I caught her whispering to Mr. Reynolds, their voices low and tense. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off with a forced smile. Nothing important. Just lock up quickly, okay? I didn't press her, but the unease grew. It happened on a quiet Friday night, just before closing. Alexa Lisa had left early, leaving me to lock up alone. I didn't mind. It gave me time to finish cleaning at my own pace. The theater was empty. The last movie ended hours ago, and the silence was broadly comforting until I saw it. While wiping the concession counter, I glanced up and caught a glimpse of something. In the reflection of the glass display, at first I thought it was a smudge, but the shape moved. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakable. A figure standing at the far end of the lobby, motionless and cloaked in shadow. I spun around, heart pounding, but the lobby was empty. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. It was late and I was tired. Still, my pulse refused to calm. I finished cleaning as quickly as possible, locked up, and headed to the dumpster to throw out the trash. The parking lot was eerily still, bathed in dim, flickering streetlights. As I approached the dumpster, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I froze. The footsteps stopped. My chest tightened as I spun around, the silence pressing in. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow slipping behind the theater's side wall. My breath hitched as adrenaline surged through me. Without thinking, I dropped the trash bag and bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. But when I glanced at the glass doors, I saw it again. The figure stood just outside, its face obscured by what looked like a mask. It was watching me. The next day, I went straight to Mr. Reynolds and told him everything. To my shock, he didn't seem surprised. "You probably imagined it," he said, his tone flat. "No, I didn't," I insisted. "There was someone outside wearing a mask." His jaw tightened. "Stay focused on your tasks and lock up on time. That's all I'll say." Frustrated, I turned to Alexa for answers. She hesitated, but finally confided in me. "This place? It's weird. I've seen things too," she admitted. "Shadows, whispers, even footsteps when no one's around. It's why I don't stay late." I stared at her, my stomach churning. "Why doesn't anyone say anything? Why are we still working here?" She shook her head. "Mr. Reynolds won't talk about it, but I've heard rumors about a man who used to work here years ago. He was disturbed, obsessed with the late-night screenings. One night, he snapped and attacked a coworker during his shift. He wore a mask to hide his identity, but they caught him eventually. Some people say his spirit lingers, replaying his final moments." My blood ran cold. The following Saturday, Alexa called in sick, leaving me alone again. I was determined to finish early and avoid any late-night encounters, but the theater seemed different that night. The air felt heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy. Every sound, the creak of the floor, the hum of the projector, set me on edge. As I cleaned the last theater room, the lights flickered. I froze, clutching my broom as darkness swallowed the room. The emergency lights didn't come on. Then I heard it. Footsteps slow, deliberate, coming from the aisle behind me. "Alexa!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the empty rows. The light caught something near the back. A figure standing just outside the glow, its head tilted unnaturally. It was wearing a mask. I dropped my phone and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I burst into the lobby. The glass doors were locked, but I could see the figure outside again, its silhouette illuminated by the flickering streetlights. Suddenly, the projector in Theater 1 turned on, casting its light through the open door. A movie began to play, static at first, then distorted images of the theater itself. On the screen, I saw myself cleaning the lobby. The timestamp was from earlier that night. I backed away, trembling. The footage jumped, now showing me in the theater, cleaning the rows. Then it changed again, and I saw the masked figure standing just behind me. So close I should have felt it. A voice whispered behind me. "You're late," I screamed, bolting for the emergency exit. The door wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Hey there, everyone. Today, we're talking about how to keep love fresh. Firstly, plan some surprise events for your partner to heat up your relationship on memorable days. Being honest and open with your partner about your feelings is also important. Remember, love isn't just about feelings. It's also about actions. If you truly care for someone, you'll take the necessary steps to keep that love alive and vibrant. So, here's a tip. Don't hesitate to express your feelings of affection toward your partner. They need to feel cherished too. Let's stay positive and keep love alive. I never thought my dog Rocky would save my life. Rocky is a German Shepherd with brown fur, sharp black markings, and a big fluffy tail. He's loyal and protective, but I always thought of him as just a sweet, loving pet. That was until one terrifying night proved how much more he was. It was late November, and the nights had started to get colder. I live alone in a small, cozy house at the edge of the woods. It's peaceful here, away from the noise of the city. Rocky and I spend most evenings curled up on the couch, him by my feet, while I read a book or watch TV. The quiet is something I've grown to love, but it can feel eerie at times, especially when the wind howls through the trees like it did that night. I remember sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. Rocky was lying near the door, his head resting on his paws, looking half asleep. It had been a long day, and I was ready to head to bed. The sound of the wind made the house creak, which wasn't unusual, but it felt louder that night. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. As I got up to turn off the lights, Rocky suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, and he stared at the door with an intensity. "What is it, boy?" I said, though I didn't expect an answer. Rocky didn't move. He just kept staring, his body tensing up like he was ready to pounce. His low growl filled the room, vibrating through the stillness. My heart started racing. I tried to listen, but all I could hear was the wind outside. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal passing by. Living near the woods, I was used to wildlife roaming around. But Rocky didn't usually act this way. Not unless something was wrong. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The yard looked empty, the shadows of the trees swaying in the sunlight. I let out a small sigh, relieved, and turned back to Rocky. "See? There's nothing out." Before I could finish, Rocky sprang to his feet, barking loudly. He rushed to the door, his nails scratching the wooden floor as he skidded to a stop. My stomach twisted. I didn't see or hear anything, but Rocky's behavior was telling me something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone just in case. Then I heard it. A soft, faint sound like the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. It was so quiet, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But Rocky barked again, louder this time. His nose pressed against the bottom of the door. Someone was out there. My hands started shaking as I dialed the emergency number. My voice trembled as I told the dispatcher what was happening. She assured me someone would be on the way, but in the meantime, she told me to stay calm and keep the line open. That was easier said than done. I backed away from the door, clutching the phone tightly. Rocky stayed where he was, growling low and deep, his tail stiff like a board. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, a knock at the door. No, not a knock. It was harder than that. Like someone was trying to force their way in. My heart leaped into my throat. Rocky's barking turned fierce, almost wild. His teeth bared as he threw his full weight against the door, as if he could push whoever it was back outside. The sound of splintering wood made me gasp. I realized whoever was on the other side was determined to get in. "Get away from the door," I shouted, though I doubted they could hear me over Rocky's barking. My voice cracked, panic making it hard to think straight. I backed further into the living room, scanning for anything I could use to protect myself. My eyes landed on the fireplace poker and I grabbed it, holding it tightly. The door burst open with a loud crash, pieces of the frame scattering onto the floor. A man stepped inside, wearing dark clothes and a mask that hid his face. He was tall and broad, and just his presence was enough to freeze me in place. But Rocky didn't hesitate. With a ferocious snarl, Rocky launched himself at the intruder. He moved so fast it was like a blur. The man stumbled back, clearly not expecting the full force of an angry German shepherd. Rocky clamped his jaws onto the man's arm, growling and shaking his head violently. The man screamed a raw guttural sound that sent shivers through me. For a moment, I just stood there, too stunned to move. But then I snapped out of it. I yelled at the man to leave, my voice shaky but loud. Rocky didn't let go, his teeth sinking deeper as the man tried to wrestle free. Blood stained the man's sleeve, and I could see the panic in his eyes, even through the mask. The man finally managed to shove Rocky off, but not before Rocky had done serious damage. He bolted out the door, clutching his arm, and disappeared into the darkness. Rocky chased him to the edge of the yard before stopping, barking after him until the night was quiet again. I sank to the floor, shaking all over. Rocky trotted back to me, his tail wagging as if nothing had happened. His mouth and fur were smeared with blood, but he didn't seem hurt. I threw my arms around him, tears streaming down my face. "Good boy," I said over and over. "You're such a good boy." The police arrived not long after. They took my statement and examined the damage to the door. One officer knelt down to pet Rocky, calling him a hero. They told me the intruder had likely been watching the house for a while, waiting for the right moment. The thought made my skin crawl, but I was grateful Rocky had been there to protect me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if Rocky hadn't been there. He wasn't just a pet. He was my guardian, my protector. Even now, I can't walk past the broken door without feeling a pang of fear. But then I look at Rocky, lying by the fireplace, his eyes watching me closely, and I know I'm safe. Rocky saved my life, and I'll never forget it. This story takes place last Christmas break. I have a wonderful family, a loving husband, and 4 amazing kids, and we all live in London. We decided to spend Christmas somewhere different that year with my siblings and parents joining us. Greenland felt like the perfect escape, a land of snowy landscapes and serene, quiet, far removed from the bustle of the city. Little did we know it would become a nightmare we'd never forget. It was December 23rd when we caught a late-night flight to Greenland. The trip was uneventful, though long. and we arrived at nearly 11 p.m., exhausted from the journey. After picking up a rental car, we drove to a cozy chalet just 10 minutes away. The house was quaint and peaceful, tucked amid snowy hills. The minute my head hit the pillow that night, I was out cold. The next day was perfect. We explored the area, marveled at the untouched beauty of the tundra, and enjoyed quality time together. By nightfall, I was convinced this would be one of the most cherished holidays of my life. But that thought was fleeting. The big day arrived, and we started it joyously. The living room lit up with laughter as the kids tore open presents. We had a hearty breakfast, and by noon, the whole family piled into the car for a short drive to a nearby mountain for a hike. The trail was breathtaking, lined with frosted trees and glittering snow. 15 minutes into the hike, we stopped to take photos. Everyone was in high spirits. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, 3 men appeared, their faces obscured by black ski masks. My heart dropped as I registered what was happening. One of them held a knife. The other 2 carried small but intimidating pistols. "Don't scream, don't run," the tallest of them said, his voice cold and detached. The children huddled close to my husband and me. Fear tightened around my chest as the reality sank in. We were completely isolated, far from any help. "Give us everything you have," one of them barked, waving his pistol. My siblings and I scrambled to comply. We handed over phones, wallets, watches, anything we could think of. The men were methodical, snatching our belongings and stuffing them into a backpack. My husband tried to stay calm, murmuring reassurances to the children, but I could see the anger and helplessness in his eyes. The third man, shorter and jittery, rifled through our bags. "That's it? This is all you've got?" he snapped, sounding frustrated. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "We don't have anything else. Just take it and leave us alone." He didn't look convinced. After what felt like an eternity, the men began backing away. For a moment, I thought the ordeal was over. But then, without warning, the shorter man grabbed my youngest son, Liam, who was only 6 years old. "No! Stop!" I screamed, lunging forward. But the tallest man shoved me back roughly. "We need leverage," the short man said. "Just in case they report us, let him go," my husband yelled, stepping forward. But the gun-wielding man raised his weapon threateningly. "Stay back or he's done," the man growled. Time seemed to freeze. My son's terrified cries pierced the air as the men dragged him off into the woods. My siblings held me back as I screamed and pleaded, desperate to run after them. We stood there, paralyzed and powerless, as the masked men disappeared into the trees, taking Liam with them. We sprinted back to the car, the weight of what just happened to sink in with every step. My husband drove us straight to the nearest police station, where we reported the robbery and abduction through tears and broken words. The officers assured us they would do everything possible to find Liam. Still, their somber expressions told me the truth. Out here in this remote wilderness, the odds were slim. That night, none of us slept. Every sound outside the chalet felt like a threat. The weight of guilt and fear pressed down on me, and I couldn't stop blaming myself. The next morning, we cut our trip short and flew back to London. Christmas had come and gone, but all I could think about was my missing son. The days that followed blurred into a haze of grief and disbelief. We worked closely with the authorities, but leads were scarce. The men had vanished without a trace, leaving no clue about where they had taken Liam or why. Weeks turned into months, and though the search continued, hope began to dwindle. Every phone call from the police filled me with equal parts hope and dread. But the answers never came. I took a leave from work, unable to focus on anything but the pain of loss. My siblings and parents tried to rally around us, offering support and love, but nothing could fill the void. Our once happy home now felt heavy with sorrow. My other children became quieter, their laughter replaced by cautious whispers. My husband and I struggled to hold each other up, each of us wrestling with guilt and grief. To this day, Liam's fate remains unknown. The masked men were never caught, and the trail went cold. Every Christmas since has been a painful reminder of what we lost that day in Greenland. This happened in 2017. My friend Eric and I were in Texas for a weekend trip, just looking for something fun to do. Eric had always been the adventurous one, always finding the weirdest things to check out. That time, he heard about an abandoned mental hospital on the edge of town. People say it's haunted, Eric said, grinning like he'd just found a treasure map. Let's see if it's true. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I wasn't going to let Eric call me a chicken. Plus, it was daylight. What could happen in broad daylight? When we got there, the hospital looked like something out of a horror movie. It was huge, with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole building seemed to groan and creak like it was alive. Looks like it'll fall on us, I joked, kicking at some rubble near the entrance. Eric laughed and marched inside. I followed, though my stomach felt uneasy. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of mold and something metallic. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, but it didn't make the place feel any less creepy. The hallway stretched out ahead of us, long and dark, lined with doors that were mostly closed. Some were open just a crack as if inviting us in. The walls were covered in faded posters and scrawled words I couldn't make sense of. We poked around for a while, finding nothing but empty rooms and broken furniture. It was just as creepy as you'd expect, but nothing was actually happening. Eric kept making jokes, tapping on walls like he was expecting a ghost to answer. Then we found the room. It was near the end of the hallway, tucked behind a heavy steel door. The door was slightly ajar, and Eric gave it a shove. The hinges screamed as it swung open. Inside, the room was bare except for a few old chairs and a table. The walls had strange symbols painted on them in black, and the air felt colder here, though I couldn't figure out why. We stepped in, and that's when we heard it. The sound of children laughing. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it grew louder, echoing off the walls until it sounded like the laughter was all around us. Eric froze for a second, and I felt my heart start to race. "Kids," he said, rolling his eyes. "They're probably outside trying to mess with us." We heard a soft thud like a small rock hitting the wall. Then another. "They're throwing rocks now," Eric muttered, annoyed. "Let's go teach them a lesson." We stepped out of the room and headed down the hallway, following the sounds of laughter and stones. The building seemed even quieter now, the air heavier somehow. When we reached the front door, Eric pushed it open and stormed outside. I followed, squinting in the sunlight, but there was no one there. We looked around the overgrown yard and checked behind the bushes and trees. Nothing. The place was empty. The laughter had stopped too, leaving an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. "There's no way they ran off that fast," Eric said, frowning. "We were right behind them. Maybe they're hiding," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. The area was so open that there was nowhere for anyone to hide. Eric called out, "Hey, nice try, but we're not scared." His voice echoed, but there was no response. We stood there for a minute just listening. The only sounds were the wind rustling the grass and the distant hum of traffic. Then faintly, we heard it again. The laughter. It was coming from inside the building. Eric and I looked at each other, and for the first time, he looked nervous. "That's not funny anymore," he said. I didn't answer. My chest felt tight and my hands were clammy. The idea of going back inside didn't sit right with me, but we had to figure out what was going on. We walked back into the hospital, moving slower this time. The laughter had stopped again, but the silence felt heavier now, like the building was holding its breath. When we reached the room again, the door was wide open, though I was certain we'd left it only partially closed. Inside, the chairs and table were gone. Eric muttered a curse under his breath. "Let's just leave, man. This place is messing with us." For once, I didn't argue. We turned and walked quickly down the hallway, not stopping until we were back outside. We didn't say much on the way back to the car. Eric kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting something to follow us. I felt the same, though I didn't want to admit it. When I was 8 years old, my world felt small but full of wonder. Little things seemed magical to me, like the soft crunch of snow under my boots, or the way snowflakes sparkled under the streetlights. One winter night, while the world outside was blanketed in fresh snow, something happened that I still can't explain. My dad had just tucked me into bed like he did every night. He pulled the blanket up to my chin, patted my head, and told me to sleep tight. I nodded, but my mind wasn't on sleep. Through the thin curtains of my window, I could see the flakes falling steadily, and all I could think about was how pretty the world must look outside. It was a cozy night. The heater hummed quietly, and the sound of the snowplow in the distance made everything feel safe. I waited until I heard my dad's footsteps fade down the hall, and the creak of his bedroom door closing. Then, I kicked off my blanket and tiptoed over to the window. Pulling the curtain aside, I pressed my face against the cold glass. The snow was coming down thicker now, glowing orange under the streetlights. The yard looked like something out of a Christmas card, untouched and smooth, with only a few tiny footprints leading toward the woods. I wondered if those were from a rabbit or maybe a fox. I stood there, lost in thought for about 5 minutes. The quiet of the snow felt peaceful, but also strange, like the world outside my window was separate from the one inside my house. Then, just as I started to feel like I was the only person awake in the world, I heard it. A loud bang from my bedroom door. The sound startled me so much that I gasped and spun around. My heart was racing, but I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. Maybe the heater made a pipe knock or the door had shifted in its frame. But when I looked at the door, my stomach dropped. There, standing in the doorway, was a person. At least, I think it was a person. It was small, about as tall as I was, but something was wrong. Its skin, or maybe it was its clothes, was completely black. It was not like shadows or darkness, but like it had soaked up every light in the room. The hallway light was on so I could see the outline of its body clearly, but there were no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just this solid black shape standing there, motionless. I froze. My mind raced with questions, but none of them made sense. Was this a trick? A shadow from something outside? Maybe it was a prank, and my dad or mom trying to scare me. But I knew it couldn't be them. This thing was too short to be my dad, and my mom wouldn't have stood silently in the doorway like that. "Hello," I whispered, my voice shaky and small. The thing didn't move. It didn't answer. I wanted to scream for my parents, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like my body had decided that staying quiet was the only safe thing to do. After a few seconds, or maybe it was minutes, I can't remember, I turned back to the window. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Maybe I was too scared to keep looking at it. I tried to focus on the snow again, but the magic was gone. The yard didn't look peaceful anymore. It looked cold and empty, like the whole world had been wiped clean. I don't know how long I stood there staring out the window. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a minute or two. Finally, I worked up the courage to glance back at the door. The black figure was gone. I ran to my bed, dove under the covers, and pulled the blanket over my head. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, too scared to move. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They both looked at me with the same expression, half concerned, half amused. It was probably just a dream, my mom said, patting my hand. My dad nodded. Or maybe you saw your shadow. The light from the hall could have made it look funny. I knew they didn't believe me, but I also knew what I saw. It wasn't my shadow, and it wasn't a dream. I was awake. I was wide awake. That thing, whatever it was, didn't come back. At least I've never seen it again. But sometimes on winter nights when the snow is falling and the house is quiet, I think about it. What was it? Why was it there? And most importantly, why didn't it do anything? Those questions still haunt me even now. I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But I do know one thing. I'll never look out the window at night again.